Good morning, dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Today is one of the remarkable days in the life of the Natural Hazard Focus Group of the American Geophysical Union. In 2011, the AGU Council accepted our proposal to establish distinguished lecture series in the Natural Hazard Focus Group. And it is a great honor today to introduce you the first speaker of this series. But before doing it, I would like to tell that this is an award named after one of the distinguished scientists in natural hazards, Dr. Gilbert F. White. Gilbert F White was a prominent American geoscientist, sometimes termed the father of the floodplain management. Dr. White is known predominantly for his work on natural hazard, particularly flooding, and importance of sound water management in contemporary society. From 1946 to 1955, Dr. White was a president of Haverford College and then returned to Chicago as a professor of geography, where he was the central figure in the so-called Chicago School of Natural Hazard Research. In 1970, he moved to the University of Colorado and founded the Natural Hazard Center. Some of the White's most notable work involved the identification and classification of adjustment mechanisms of flooding in the United States, perceptions of natural hazards, and choice of natural hazard adjustments. Gilbert F. White received numerous honors in his lifetime, including the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, the United Nations Sasakawa International Environmental Prize, Laureate d'Honneur, the International Geographical Union, the Volvo Environmental Prize and National Medal of Science from the NSF. He was elected to the National Academies and the American Academy of Art and Sciences. The first White distinguished lecturer is Dr. Rothstein. Dr. Stein is a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park, California. Roth studies how earthquakes interact by the transfer of stress. He graduated from Brown University with magna cum laude and received his PhD from Stanford University. Dr. Stein is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and Geological Society of America. He was editor of Journal of Geophysical Research and chaired AGU Board of Journal Editors. He was a visiting professor at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris and de Strasbourg, as well as the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Dr. Stein chairs the scientific board of the Global Earthquake Model Program, a public-private partnership building a worldwide seismic risk model. He is also chairs the Future Direction Group of the USGS Earthquake Science Center and sits on the National Catastrophe Advisory Council of Zurich Insurance Group. Roth is one of mostly cited earthquake scientists. He received the Eugene Schumacher Distinguished Achievement Award of USGS and the Outstanding Contributions and Cooperation in Geoscience Award from NOAA. It's really my great pleasure to invite Dr. Rothstein to give the first lecture, the 2012 Gilbert F. White lecture entitled Defeating Earthquakes. Roth, it's time to give a lecture.
Thank you. I'm very lucky today that my wife Sharon is in the audience, but I'm going to steal her thunder. Whenever she is in the audience of a talk I give, she yells out, "Check his facts." So now I've been able to get it out before she does. You're looking at a typical building that you would find anywhere in the world. We have somehow decided to build our buildings out of a stack of cubes. And cubes have the property that no matter how well bolted down this building is to the ground, no matter how strong the columns and the beams are, this building is only as strong as its corners. In an earthquake, the building will be shaken principally side by side, and you can see if the corners are weak, this building is weak. Many buildings also involve vertical motions of the ground, and you can see the weakness of this building. And all earthquakes involve torsion, twisting of the ground, and this building is weak as well. If any one of these corners breaks, this building is coming down. It's only as strong as its weakest corner. Now, this is the identical building. But if all we've done is snapped in, literally just snapped in, these little triangular corner braces. Now look. Look. Nothing. Nothing under all of those circumstances. Because this building's corners have been strengthened. It costs only 10% more to build this building than this building. The cost of a bathroom. But no one is going to go from this building to this building unless they're convinced they're at risk. And that is what we must do. We must let the world's inhabitants know who are at risk that they are, so that they can begin to make the choices to do the right thing. Now, I should say that most buildings that we live in today are not made of wood. They're made of reinforced concrete, such as the building we're in now. And the strength from the corners is provided by rebar, steeled rods of ribbed, that extend inside the columns and beams and flare out in all directions and create essentially an implicit triangle of steel to give the building its strength, rather than having a triangular feature like that. The problem is, you can't tell if that rebar is in this building or any building because it's concealed within the concrete. Let me tell you a story. After the 1999 Ismat earthquake in Turkey, which killed 20,000 people, I traveled and worked with a documentary film crew that was interviewing survivors. And we met a young professional couple, the Erkmans, who were in a building much like this on the second story. And that building, when the earthquake occurred, the building slammed down on them. All of the upper floors slammed down on them. They had been given for their wedding a steel-framed bed, and that bed supported 4 stories of concrete above them. They were alive, but they were trapped in a space about like this in their bed. And Mr. Erkman was able to peel up a wooden floorboard that the post of the bed had gone through, found a PVC tube, broke it off, and water came out of it. And they were able to stay hydrated during the 60 hours it took until they were rescued. Their 6-year-old son in the next building had died. After we heard this story, we went to the site of their building, and next to it was another one that looked just like it, but it had one of this part still standing. But there was a huge crack in the corner, and I wanted to feel how much rebar there was. Was it dense enough? Was it wrapped with steel as it needs to be? And we had a hydraulic lift, and they put me on the lift, and I got up there, and I put my hand in, and I pulled out a hunk of styrofoam. The world would be a safer place if concrete were translucent. Now let me show you something else. In Turkey and in most parts of the world, the builder, to recover their investment, wants to put retail space or maybe a parking structure in the bottom floor of that building. So what they do, retail space, think big expanses of picture windows. So basically what they do is remove any of the support in the bottom floor of the building when they design the building. And this is what an engineer calls a soft first-story building. This is the worst building you can build. This building is heavy on the top and light and weak on the bottom. The world is filled with these buildings. They're right here in San Francisco. Tuck under parking is a very common problem. This is our inheritance. So these are the kind of, we need people to go from this building to succeed. And this is the kind of buildings people are living in. Notice the great corners. And here's what happens to buildings like that. In the 12 or so years since that August 1999 earthquake till today, there have been close to 1 million earthquake deaths. How could that be happening? How could the rate of deaths and destruction from earthquakes be accelerating at such a rate when we're learning so much about earthquake occurrence? And the answer seems to me that the world's population is flowing into megacities, cities with more than 1 million people, building more poorly than we have in the past to accommodate this influx of people. And there are about 50 of these megacities astride the plate tectonic boundaries. And these people are caught between the opposing demographic and tectonic forces. And they are the targets of chance. And increasingly, we are finding in Wenshan, in Pakistan, in Haiti, that they are suffering. To give you a sense of this global problem, let me just show you population density. So here's the population density of Eurasia. And until I saw this image, I hadn't appreciated that Egypt is not a country. It's a river of humanity in inky blackness. I also hadn't understood that no one's home in Switzerland. Now, if I superimpose on this map cities, megacities at risk, you can see Tehran, Istanbul, Algiers, many of the places that we know are very much an issue. But now I want to wipe those cities off the map, and I want to flip it over to show you population density at the same scale on the other side of the map. And now you see the full dimension of the problem. Look at Java at the bottom of the map, the most densely populated place on Earth. Look at eastern China or northern India. Now when we put cities at risk, we see vastly more. And we understand for the first time that no matter how well we built seismic hazard models for California or New Zealand or Japan, this is what we have to do well. We have to understand Asia's earthquake hazards, South Asia, South America, because these are where the vast majority of people are at risk. Let me zoom in to India. India has been engaged in a 40 million year long slow motion collision into Asia. It's as if in a car crash, you slowed the camera down so much that the car had impacted the truck in front of it. The engine of the car is already in the driver's compartment, but the people in the back seat still don't even know there's an accident in progress. And the front fender of this accident are those red ellipses you see in this image, the sites of magnitude 8 to 9 earthquakes over the last millennia. The problem is that no such great earthquake has occurred in many generations, so the cultural memory of this risk is lost. But there are now 400 million people living in the Ganges Plain. This would be like 150% of the US population living along the San Andreas Fault. That's the gun we've loaded in India. And unless we understand that hazard, and unless we are able to convey hazard to the apartment dwellers and people who live there, we are not going to change the rate of death and destruction of earthquakes in the near future. One earthquake alone in 1897, on the right side of that map, reduced to rubble every masonry building over an area the size of England. And today the population there is almost 10 times higher than it was at that time in 1897. So in 2008, several of us founded the Global Earthquake Model to address this problem. This is, let me just pop back. The earthquake at the top of the figure there, 2005, too small even to warrant an ellipse, is the Pakistan earthquake that killed 80,000 people. This hill, Bacalo Hill, 1,600 people died right there. Every single building on that hill is destroyed. This image also illustrates what we don't understand. There is no destruction on the other side of the fault, just as close to the site of shaking. So we founded GEM with the goal of raising risk awareness globally, and to do so by building the world's first seismic risk model. And by risk, I mean not just the likelihood of shaking, but its consequences in terms of death, damage, and dollars, and tools to contend with that risk. GEM's principles are first and foremost to raise risk awareness, without which nothing will happen. We have no illusion that models or maps raise risk awareness. Earthquakes do. But when an earthquake strikes, people need a credible place to go to seek the information. Am I at risk? And if so, what can I do about it? And if we don't build it, everybody has an excuse to stay ignorant, to do nothing. There is also an enormous opportunity here scientifically, because it's my contention that if we only build sophisticated hazard models in places like California or Japan or New Zealand, they are essentially untestable, because there are not enough large damaging earthquakes that will occur in a short amount of time to learn how much better than chance are we doing. The way out of this conundrum is to build a global model, because then we will capture so many large earthquakes that in a short amount of time we can learn how to do this better. We can advance the science of seismic hazard assessment only if we do it globally. And by credible, I mean no hubris and no black boxes. Most of the information on seismic risk of the world today is available to paying customers, and we have to change that. Now, the elements of GEM are that we have a public-private partnership. We have currently 10 companies and 14 countries that are sponsors to GEM, providing expertise and financial backing. And in addition, we have 8 non-governmental organizations providing their expertise and concern for the developing world. And together, GEM makes all of its financial decisions, and its broad governance is provided by this group in which we are bringing together people in companies and countries. And I think it's worth mentioning that in a competitive world, for a company to put the acquisition of information in the public good to be above private gain takes courage. And then we have a scientific board which guides the scientific enterprise of GEM, and as you can see, we are pulling from a very broad group of expertise to accomplish what we have in mind. It is not just an earth science problem, it's an economics problem, it's a social science problem. And all of these elements are important if we are going to learn not only how to capture what we know about earthquake hazards and present it to people, but so that we can do this in a manner that people make good decisions. Now, the elements of GEM are simple. There are 4. At the heart, we have the open Quake software engine. Our goal here is to create the state-of-the-art seismic hazard and risk assessment software that is beginning to be taught around the world, will be available to everyone. It's purely open source, so that we can begin to standardize the process and give everybody the same tools, the same high-quality tools with which to work. Then we are gathering 10 global components data sets, without which we will never improve seismic hazard assessment. Models are built in the regional programs by national scientists in those countries. And in 2014, when the public portal launches, our model will be available to everyone in forms that different people can use, whether or not you're a power user or a member of the public. Now, let's first just make a comment about Open Quake. It has a great deal of tools, not only to calculate hazard, but to work with the data sets that are going to come in. earthquakes, faults, strain, building inventories, building fragilities, whether or not you've got this building or you've got this building. Moving to the data sets, I want to focus in this talk on a couple of the hazard components because we're geophysicists in this room, but you can see that the goal is to move to the right. That unless you give someone a tool that tells them what are the costs and benefits of retrofitting, turning this building into a strong building is more expensive, we need to be able to say, does it pay? Should you be getting insurance? Should you be moving? Unless we provide those tools, people have a very good reason to do nothing. So let's look at the two of these efforts. This is a $12 million investment in these data sets that we're gathering. I want to show you the instrumental Quake catalog and the geodetic strain model. So this catalog covers the period 1900 to 2009, and my contention is that it obsoletes its predecessor, what's known as the Centennial Catalog, and that's because, like many of these projects, it's been built by the people who built the original, but now they have real resources and an opportunity to do it right. And doing it right when it comes to taking all those earthquakes from the first half of the 1900s and recalculate them in a computer, which they hadn't been done before, requires that you gather together these records from all over the world and digitize them. And what you're seeing on the table here are not all the records. It's also everything in the boxes behind the table. And they thought they could automatically digitize these. Many of these ancient, early 1900 records literally fell apart in their hands. So they had to be hand digitized. So the opportunity to do this, we wouldn't have even had it 10, 15 years from now. And as a result, you can see that over 1 million phase records have been digitized, and everything has been recomputed. And now we have a uniform catalog, all in the same kind of moment magnitude measure, with new depths, new locations. Okay, what does money buy? Well, first of all, we began to see the Earth's earthquakes, and we are confronted with the problems that we have in seismic hazard assessment. So, for example, at the top of the map, the Mexican subduction zone, we've never seen an earthquake over about 8.5. Possibly in 1787, there was an 8.6. Moving south to Peru and Chile there, we've seen up to 9.5. So people have, in general, chosen upper scale magnitudes for the models in Mexico to be around 8.5, but 9.5 in Chile. Does that make any sense? The only way to answer that question is to look at the problem globally, to look at all the word subduction zones and decide, is there really such a limit? Or if, as Rob McCaffrey and Jan Kagan and Peter Bird and David Jackson have argued, there simply isn't enough of a record to make that judgment that any one subduction zone is incapable of producing a truly great earthquake. Moving around to the other side of the globe, you see Java at the bottom of the picture, which I showed you was so populated. Now you see that it's also so populated with earthquakes. Looking at India's collision in Tibet, you begin to see that that collision isn't confined to the front bumper, but India is extruding Tibet into Asia. And so the zone of earthquakes extends right across Tibet. It's a very, very wide collision zone. Let me show you Taiwan, obviously a very seismically active country. And one of the efforts of the ISC GEM seismic catalog was to go through 1,000 research papers where people, some in this room, have recalculated moments and magnitudes and depths of earthquakes and included that. So this Kanamori et al. Paper found that the earthquake that was thought to be in the ocean is actually under Taipei. And obviously this matters if you're going to try to make some judgment about Taipei's earthquake hazards, particularly when there's a 101-story building sitting right in there, which the people from Taiwan call a stack of Chinese takeout cartons. Moving to South America, you can see the almost, it would appear kind of from space, pathological association of population and earthquakes in the Cordillera of South America. Everywhere we have quakes, we have people. You're looking at Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru and Peru to Chile, and Chile to Argentina. And if we look at a couple of those cities, this is Caracas, a city that obviously suffers from the lack of urban planning, just from where people are living cheek by jowl against an active fault. 7 million people. Bogota, again, a major city, 6 million people living astride an active fault. So this is what we see when we move up close, this very, very high exposure. Now, I would like to now say, okay, why are we spending resources to create a global strain model? In my judgment, this is one of the places where GEM offers a real push forward in the scientific ability of producing useful seismic hazard information. What you're looking at is the strain over the western U.S. from Utah stretching to the San Andreas system. And obviously, highest strain is along the San Andreas, but you can see that although there are faults across all of Nevada, the strain is actually only high on the western side of Nevada. Now, if we compare this to earthquakes, you can see that they are highly correlated. So on the right, that's essentially just counting earthquakes above a completeness level in those boxes. But the kind of seismic catalog we have in California, in the western U.S., which brings us down to very small earthquakes, is not available in most parts of the world, which means that the strain map is a very powerful proxy for earthquake potential in areas where the catalog is very frail or very inadequate. Let me take you back to Asia. So I talked about India crashing into Asia. Now you saw previously how those earthquakes were spread out, but you can see in the GPS vectors, the strain itself is widely distributed. Any place where a GPS vector either changes length or direction, there must be strain. So we can use this, or Corne Creamer, who's the head of this group, has used this to calculate the strain across Asia. And you can see that there are areas that really light up as being bands of high strain, and these are associated with some of the key faults. And in so many parts of the world, we only have reconnaissance information on faults. We know that the faults are there, but we don't know which are the major players. But with the strain data, often what happens is we can distinguish which are the faults that carry most of the slip, and therefore are going to confer most of the earthquakes. You can also see the Himalaya foothill itself as a band of high strain. Another example is Iran. The preceding data set, the global strain rate model of 2004, you can see that now there is about 4 times more GPS data for this global model. And as a result, the strain model shown below is much more detailed than it was before. Let me blow that up for you. And when I superimpose this with the ISC GEM catalog earthquakes, you see in general a good correspondence between warm colors in earthquakes and the lack of earthquakes in the cool color areas. But you can also see that there are some regions, such as offshore from Dubai, or Tehran, Tabriz, and Baku, where the strain is high, but we haven't seen many earthquakes. And this might mean this is probably an artifact of our seismic record being too short. And this is why this strain record is so important. And when you look at a couple of these cities, 12 to 15 million people in Tehran living next to an active fault, a city with essentially no building codes as far as I understand, or Baku in Azerbaijan, also very close to major active faults, and as you've seen, a very, very high strain area. This allows us to identify those regions as being hazardous, whereas if we were working from the catalog alone, we wouldn't see it. Now, if we zoom out, you can see this entire region that we have for the global strain rate model, and how important it will be in trying to use uniform tools to capture the seismic hazards throughout the world. And obviously, the most important signal that we are seeing in the strain are the subduction zones. GEM is using slab 1.0 from Gavin Hayes and David Wald. This is 40,000 kilometers of subduction zones. And it's our contention that only if you study all of these subduction zones can you make the decisions about what kind of hazard can befall the subduction zone in your area. And there's some huge questions for subduction zones off Crete or the Caribbean. Can they produce mega earthquakes? We don't know, but our best effort will be to look at the world's subduction zones as a whole. And GEM has benefited enormously. This slide somehow is out of place, but this is just that comparison of strain rate model and the catalog. And you can see with the earthquakes that in general there's a very, very good correspondence. But there are some places, such as the Hindu Kush, where we seem to have had more earthquakes, and more importantly, the Himalaya foothills, where during the last century, as I mentioned to you earlier, we haven't seen a lot of earthquakes, but we know from the historical data, and now we know from the strain, this is an area that has a very high hazard. I want to acknowledge the contribution being made by many geological surveys and seismic institutions to the GEM undertaking. These are 3 from my own institution, the USGS, and the Southern California Earthquake Center, that are very important to GEM's success, as well as the work of Geoscience Australia, GNS Science of New Zealand, the British Geological Survey, NORSAR from Norway, the Swiss Seismic Service, NIED, and JMA of Japan. All of these groups are contributing, I think, because not only do we feel the need to contribute to this greater effort, we all understand that we will do better with our own hazards if we construct a global model. But nevertheless, there is combat in the debate front, in the hazard front, and perhaps this was triggered by the occurrence of the magnitude 9 earthquake in Japan in 2010, an unforeseen earthquake in terms of its size, not its location, that gave us pause about whether or not we are doing the right thing. And this kind of crossfire is an important element of science, and GEM's strategy is not to circle the wagons, but to try to embrace this and to harness the views of the community and see what tests can we conduct to find our way out of these problems. So, for example, we brought together the people producing seismic hazard models in slowly deforming parts of the world, such as Canada or Australia or Europe or the central US, with some of our critics. And we did the same thing working with people from the fast deforming regions of the world, such as California or New Zealand, with some of our critics, to try to see what kind of answers could we come up with. And I think what grows out of these discussions, these very important discussions at the Powell Center, are tests we can conduct, decisions we've made to essentially abandon the notion that we can peg what the maximum magnitude is on any fault before that earthquake occurs, and also to make sure that we're building into OpenQuake the tools and tests that people need to analyze their data more fully. Now, I want to say that we have to approach this effort with great humility, because we know in this room that our ability to forecast the future is very limited, and that GEM is really just part of a much larger chain of preparedness, that we could not do what we did had not seismic and geodetic monitoring took place. Those data need to be understood and interpreted by earth scientists, and we need engineers to understand how that shaking affects buildings and how to build buildings better. But my view is that GEM is the link in the chain that we can make strong. We need help to do it. There's an enormous task ahead of us in building our inventory of the world's active faults, never before attempted, in augmenting our global catalog by regional seismic catalogs. We have 12 earthquakes in Australia for the last 100 years. Obviously, we need other catalogs to do that. In building the regional models, and in creating a global inventory of the world's buildings, also never attempted. But let me show you a case where I think our link in this chain matters and is worth pursuing. Going back to South America, you're looking at Ecuador, and the capital of Ecuador, Quito, 2 miles up, 2 million people living amid a history of large earthquakes. And if we zoom in on Quito, you can see that these people live on a basin on top of what's presumed to be an active thrust fault, really the worst prescription that you might want to write. And Ecuador joined GEM 2.5 years ago, and with GEM's help, built its first ever seismic hazard model. And as a result of that model, the government has decided to build its first building code. And because of the model, insurance can be offered because it has to be priced by risk. So this is the virtuous cycle that has begun in Ecuador with GEM's help. GEM is invisible here. It's the Ecuadorian scientists who are the spokespersons to their government who are triggering these things to happen. But it's the kind of development that we would like to help spawn and promote around the world. Because even in areas of modest means, you can build better. Here's a beautiful example of a building I came upon in the Andes, a home-built building, light on the top, heavier on the bottom, filled with triangles, local wood, very flexible. This building is probably quite safe. Seismically strong buildings can be beautiful. They do not have to be mastodons. So I want to leave you with one final image, one that I've always found a talisman for our science and for what we do. You're looking at a man on the right who's determined to be about 21 years old, and his arms are around a woman of about 19, and she is cradling in her arms a baby, about 1 or 2 years old. This family was crushed by their dwelling in the Roman port town of Kurion on Cyprus in 365 AD during the Great Crete earthquake. 16 centuries after this family lost its life, the Erckman's son should not lose his. We must learn how to build better, and we must provide people with the understanding and the means to encourage them to make that leap from weak buildings to strong ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, very much for the inspiring and quite interesting lecture. And now, floor is open for questions. Please, questions. Yes, please.
I have a problem with your GM because from the beginning of your organization, you start the emphasis on the risk, the issue of risk. It really should be the hazard. We are so much ignorant about earthquake hazard evaluation and assessment in many parts of the world that we show. To quantify our ignorance is no good. And so you need to balance that with going back to the issue of hazard. We don't understand even the hazard here in California. There are so many things need to be done. You have not mentioned at all in your lecture anything about geology. Our problem evaluating hazard in the majority of those continental regions is geological in nature. Seismology will play very little to evaluate the hazard. You have to go back and understand the quaternion geology and deformation.
Thank you, Mario.
Also, your funding coming from part of it, from this insurance company is not really rewarding. And I don't like to see insurance company for their own objective and agenda. They will see a simple model generated by earthquake so they can do business one way or another.
Okay, thank you for these important comments. First, one of the things I've learned working in GEM is that the hazard people feel that the hazard is the problem. The risk people or the exposure people feel that the exposure is the problem, not knowing where the world's buildings are. The vulnerability people feel that the vulnerability is the problem. How do each type of buildings respond to shaking? The economists and social scientists will tell us that the amplifying factor of an earthquake is by far the biggest problem. It's not necessarily the direct damage itself, but the long-term economic consequences that we saw in this country in Katrina and that we've seen in many earthquakes. So while there are certainly questions in hazard, they're not uniquely important. They're all important. And the risk that we run if we just focus on hazards is we simply scare people. We just tell people that they're going to get whacked by an earthquake, but we give them no tools to contend with it. So I believe GEM must be holistic. We must acknowledge the weaknesses in the hazard work that we do, but that is accompanied by many others. Now, let me make a comment about the insurance companies, because I actually believe they are a very welcome and important part of this public-private partnership. If you're an insurance company, let's say Farmers Insurance, providing earthquake insurance in California, you can be wiped out in one earthquake because too many of your policyholders will all suddenly need money. So you offload most of your risk to a bigger company, a super insurance company called a reinsurance company. These companies, reinsurance companies, need to diversify globally. They have to understand Santiago's risk compared to Ecuador's, compared to Tokyo's, compared to LA. And GEM is helpful for that because we are trying to create a global model built in a more uniform fashion than has ever happened before. So in fact, our self-interests align, and it is very valuable to have them on board. And this is a public enterprise where Quake and our data set are available for the public. So I am thrilled that these companies want to support such a public enterprise. And in fact, unless we learn how to do this, unless we engage private companies into the enterprise of science, we're going to be continuously limited. So we need to talk across this world of scientists and business people.
Other questions, please?
More friendly questions.
In fact, yes, please.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in talking about the social risk.
Speak a little louder.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right in talking about social amplification and other societal factors and their contribution to risk and how important they are. And I think you're right in going through a holistic project like this, that maybe you're not waiting for the science to be absolutely perfect before we come and do something about bigger issues of risk and vulnerability. So I think that's the right approach. If we wait for the science to be perfect all over the world, or as good all over the world as it is in Southern California, we're not helping anyone. My question to you, or my comment to you, in your illustrations, you showed a flowchart beginning with hazard, with arrows proceeding in one direction, and the end result being, society. I think a better diagram might be some that is in some of the sociological literature that shows hazard on one side, society on the other, all pointing in towards the risk and vulnerability side. So, yeah, that's really
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any questions? Yes, please.
Project seems right into the motion with building performance. Are there considerations of other close-seismic phenomena, soil compaction, earthquake-induced landslide, that contributes to the risk?
So this is a great question. The gentleman asked, why are you just focusing on buildings when there's so many other things that can go wrong in an earthquake? And the answer is GEM simply has to start at one chunk that we can get through by 2014. We would love to extend to associated perils such as tsunamis or liquefaction, landslides, and even go beyond that. We've tried to build a structure where we could go beyond that to volcanic hazards or things like that. So this is already overly ambitious undertaking to do in 5 years, but we recognize that it's not the whole story. Infrastructure damage has a very long-lasting effect from earthquakes too, so your point is very well taken.
More questions? Behind, yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, the L'Aquila manslaughter conviction really subverts much of what all of us do, and puts a terrible kind of pall on our desire to provide the best science we can to people who need it. And I think what we must do is not be deterred and to remember that our compact with the public is to tell them what we know and to tell them what we don't know. And if we do that, we are doing our job and we acknowledge our weaknesses.
On Thursday would be union session dedicated to this specific event, risk communication. Other questions? Yes, please.
Sometimes governments or agencies are reluctant to share data or make vulnerability information public. How do you get buy-in from governments and agencies?
So the question is, how do we avoid the problem of governments being unwilling to give us data? We don't completely avoid it. It's a terrible problem. There are many developing countries that to feed their economic miracle growth, they need to provide water and power, which involves building hydroelectric facilities in foothills laced by faults. So you might think that these countries have a disincentive to be frank about their earthquake hazards. Other countries simply consider that their earthquake record is in their national interest and is not to be shared. So our view is that this will always be a problem, but our best shot at overcoming it is to build GEM as a global community of scientists and governments and companies, to put the kind of gentle pressure on governments to do the right thing. That we are going to be more successful getting this information than a private company would, for example. And we don't buy data, we ask people to share it, and it's our hope, too, that the people who are sharing their data with us get something back. Maybe a better model, maybe better tools, so that this exchange will grow. But it is a problem. And this is why the globally uniform data sets like Global Strain or the Global Catalog are so important to us. Maui pointed out, I didn't talk significantly about geology. Active fault files are very, very difficult to obtain from many countries. And yes, they're obviously important. So we just have to continue to try to tease these data sets out of the reluctant people.
I think we are coming to the closure of this session, and I would like just to mention Roth started with the presentation of buildings. It is so important, really, how to build. More than 250 years ago, great philosopher and natural scientist Immanuel Kant wrote that why people blame the God if they are building from inflammable material. At that time was a belief that the earthquake generate fire. That was a citation of Immanuel Kant. That is exactly, we know that it's the people killed not by earthquake, by the constructions. I thank very much Roth, who raised these important things. Definitely, today integrated research on disaster risk is one of the important issues, starting from geology, starting from geodesy, go all the way to the policymakers and end users. That is the only way to prevent people against disasters. And again, I would like now address thanks to Rothstein and introduce this plaque to Roth. It is a plaque in the form of tsunami made. And it is a natural hazard focus group, recognized Rothstein, the 2012 Gilbert F White Distinguished Lecturer for outstanding contribution to basic knowledge of seismic hazard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I built these with Max Willis, undergraduate, and they're on our website. There's instructions on how to build and buy them.